What happened to $500 million in art stolen from the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in 1990? Let's get on it right now. Hey friends, how you doing? Eric Ulis here. Thanks for joining me once again today. Today I'm going to talk about the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum heist, and I'm going to give you an update on my investigation into this huge mystery related to this heist that took place March 18th, 1990 in Boston, Massachusetts. Now today I'm going to tell you who I think was involved. I'm going to tell you how I believe the event actually unfolded. And most importantly at all, I'm going to tell you what I believe actually happened to the art. So for the purposes of providing a little bit of background here, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum was robbed in the very early morning hours of March 18, 1990, again in Boston, Massachusetts. Two guys that were dressed as Boston police officers managed to work their way into the museum. They bound up the two security guards that were on duty that night, and they spent 81 minutes in the museum, ultimately stealing 13 pieces of art, some of which included Rembrandts, a few Rembrandts actually, a Vermeer, and some other exceptionally valuable pieces, not only monetarily of enormous value, but also culturally speaking of enormous value as well. Now back in 1990, at the time that this event occurred, that the heist occurred, the value of these items was pegged at $200 million. Today, 2022, the value of those items is pegged between $500 million and $1 billion. And it's actually been described as the biggest theft in the history of the world. So this is a very big deal. Now, in 2013, the FBI did announce that they do believe that they know who the two individuals were that actually robbed the museum, and they believe that they know what happened. They just don't know where the art is. Importantly, they have been unwilling to name the two people that they think were involved with it. Now, we know this much, that they believe that these two people were involved with organized crime. And I'm not suggesting organized crime like this gigantic network perhaps, but they were involved with that, at least a small gang of criminals, if you will, that seem to be plugged in with organized crime, at least in the New England area. They also believe that these two individuals, of course, are dead. So now, as to why the FBI has been unwilling to really be forthright at all with respect to any of this, especially considering it's been 32 years and we really don't know anything with respect to where this artwork is a little bit vague as far as I'm concerned. You know, the rationale that the FBI has been given is that, hey, if we name the two individuals, we're going to get a bunch of people calling us and we'll have to weed through all the bad information, which just frankly seems a little disingenuous to me and doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense. Again, it's been 32 years. You either want to get the stuff back or you want to play games. You want to be superhero. You want to be the guy who finds the stuff, and you're going to make sure that you keep your arms around all the relevant information and facts and evidence and so forth around the case, because you want to make sure that you're the cat, you're the guy, you're the person who ends up solving the mystery and recovering the art or what have you. So that's just sort of what it comes across to me or strikes me as opposed to a genuine effort to really get this stuff back, to recover the artwork by virtue of putting all the information and everything out there and seeing what happens to come back to you. And again, remember, this has been 32 years. This hasn't been, 2 weeks ago, where I can see how you want to hold things close to the chest. It's been 32 years. And the statistics, folks, they aren't very good for artwork that's been gone for 32 years. The recovery rate is pretty much basically like almost non-existent. So there you go as far as that goes. That said, I'm going to tell you who I believe was involved with it. I'm also going to tell you how I believe it occurred. And most importantly at all, I'm going to tell you what I think happened to the art. And this just, this isn't me just, pulling stuff out of thin air. This is really the byproduct of a lot of investigative research that I've done as well, talking with a lot of people in the know about this stuff and learning a lot about, I think, ultimately what happened. That said, no smoking gun. I'm going to say that right out front. No smoking gun, not the kind of thing that's going to land somebody in jail and convict somebody. And frankly, 32 years out, that may be all we're kind of left to work with as far as that goes. So to start off with, I'm going to tell you that the principal, the main person that was involved with this case, in my mind, is a guy named Brian McDevitt. Now, Brian McDevitt is somebody who has been talked about for years as a suspect in this heist. So this isn't a new name that I'm bringing forward here. This is somebody who's been talked about as a suspect. Nonetheless, it is somebody that appears to have been kind of brushed aside by law enforcement. And honestly, I don't really know how to account for that. I'm not really sure the reason for that. So let me tell you a little bit about Brian McDevitt. Now, the reason he became a suspect almost immediately, if not immediately after Gardner Museum Heist, is because 10 years before, 1980, Brian, then at the age of 20 and an accomplice, tried to rob a museum in upstate New York with an MO very, very similar to what ultimately transpired at the Gardner Museum. I won't get into all the details with it, but I'll just say that the MO was remarkably similar. So it stands to reason that when the authorities, looking for who was involved or potential suspects with the Gardner Museum heist, looked at Brian, they thought, this is a guy we need to talk with because this is remarkably similar as far as it goes. At the time that the heist took place at the Isabel Stewart Gardner Museum, Brian was 29 years of age. So he's about 29 and a half. So he's a few months away from his 30th birthday. Now, let me tell you a little bit about just who Brian was. Brian was just sort of a guy that was just rotten to the core, just the consummate con man. And he's the kind of guy that basically whatever he wanted is the only thing that mattered to him, and collateral damage be damned. He was going to do whatever he needed to do to get the things that he wanted. So comes to stealing items or what have you, he didn't think twice about the victim. He didn't think twice about the damage or what have you. He was going to get it. He was going to get what he wanted to get, and that was about it. So he's just an exceptionally selfish individual. I don't want to say he was amoral. I don't know if I would go as far as saying he was amoral, but there's a possibility that the guy just was outright amoral because, again, it was just all about him. So that's very important to know as we proceed through this conversation here, and I give you an idea of why I think that Brian McDevitt was actually involved with this heist. So one of the things that I did as I started looking into McDevitt was reaching out to people who knew McDevitt, one of whom was an old girlfriend of his, a woman named Stephanie Rabinowitz, who dated Brian from basically the summer of 1989 going into 1990. So he dated Brian, or rather she dated Brian over the time that the heist took place. What makes Stephanie invaluable as a witness is she knew nothing of Brian's true identity at the time that she met him, certainly wasn't aware of the Gardner Museum heist at the time that it occurred, but most importantly, she kept a journal. She kept a daily journal recording down conversations, things that happened during that time. So we actually have entries into her journal for the exact day of the heist. So we know exactly what was going on with her and Brian at the time of the actual heist. And it's fascinating to read through those journals. And there's also information related to conversations with Brian after the heist and some things that occurred before the heist as well that I think help flesh out the picture here. Now, I should say that when she first met Brian in July of 1989 and they first started dating, that Brian told her that he was a writer for the Wonder Years. He worked on some other television shows and programming and writing and things of this nature, which was just straight up BS. It wasn't true. Brian, again, being the consummate con man, wasn't even honest with her about it. So as far as she knows, he's a pretty cool guy. He's got a lot of things going on for him, 29 years old, writing for TV shows, writing scripts, things of this nature. So she's impressed. She's a few years younger than Brian. But nonetheless, she was very impressed with the guy at the time, and it makes sense. So, but interestingly, there was a trip in December of 1989. So this is just a few months before the heist took place that she took with Brian to Jamaica, and it also involved a couple of other friends of Brian as well, and their girlfriends as well. And Stephanie also took photos and things of that nature during that time. One of the people who was on that trip with them to Jamaica in December of 1989 was a guy named Steve Donahue. Steve Donahue was a few years older than Brian, and I suspect that Steve Donahue was one of the two people who was actually involved with robbing the Isabel Stewart Gardner Museum that night, and I believe that Brian was the other person involved. So I think it was Brian and Steve. Those were the two who were involved. Now I should note, I'm going to kind of fast forward a little bit here, neither Brian nor Steve is still alive. They're both gone. Brian died in 2004 in Colombia because he had fled to the South America, Central America, but he died in 2004. And Steve as well died many, many years ago. Basically, somebody plunged a knife into his chest, murdered him, obviously, and my understanding is that the murderer was never caught. So neither one of these two guys is alive today. So can't ask these guys or question these guys about this here. But going back to Jamaica, December of 1989, I do know, and this is according to Stephanie, whom I know quite well, that Brian was there, and they were there not only to have some fun and enjoy the sun and everything else, but also they were there on business. So there were some business dealings that were taking place in Jamaica. Stephanie is not really sure what those business dealings were, but I think it's pretty much safe to say that these guys weren't up to any good, and that's for damn sure. So there were some business dealings that took place there. Again, Jamaica, 1989, just a few months before the Gardner Museum heist. That's important to remember that. So now let's forward to a few months to the night of the heist, actually. Now, I should preface this by saying that a couple of days before the heist took place, which again was the very early morning hours of March 18, 1990, which was the evening after St. Patrick's Day, which obviously is March 17th, and is a very, very big deal in Boston. Everybody's out partying and having a good time. So the date is one that's pretty easy to remember, but that's when it took place. But a couple days before that, Brian said he was not going to be around that weekend. He said that he was going to be in New York City attending a Writers Guild Awards ceremony, which was, again, BS, not true. The Writers Guild Awards ceremony that year did not take place in March. It actually took place some period of time after that. So we do know that that was a lie. And Stephanie actually writes in her journal about this, writes in her journal about the fact that, she knows that Brian's heading off to New York and he'll be out of touch and everything else. Because again, this is before cell phones. That's important to remember. This is before cell phones. This is before the internet. This is before email. So communication is a little bit more difficult, back in 1990 than it is today. And as it was, I believe the last time she spoke with Brian was March 16th. So a day and a half basically before the heist took place. She actually writes in her journal that he was kind of antsy, almost in kind of a bad mood. He was worked up, anxious about something. And that is in the journal. And again, remember, Stephanie is unaware of any of this. Anything about the heist going to be taking place, doesn't really know anything about Brian's true history or anything of that nature. So that's just a fascinating thing to read about, what Brian's state of mind was and what was taking place here in the days immediately preceding the Gardner Museum heist. Stephanie did not talk with Brian at all until the evening of March 18th. So this would have been, 12 or so hours after the heist took place, perhaps even a little longer, maybe 18 hours after the heist took place. Brian did reach out to her And apparently Brian was back in town, back in Boston at this point, and there were some conversations about getting together perhaps the next day or what have you, which didn't happen. They didn't actually get together for a couple of days after that. I believe March 20th was when they saw each other once again. So the tall and short of it is, between March 16th and March 20th, there's a complete blank. We as far as Stephanie was concerned, Brian is in New York at this, Writers Guild award ceremony. No communication, no phone calls, no nothing during that 4-day span. And it just so happens to be that is the period of time that the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum heist obviously took place. Okay, now it's important to know that Stephanie and him were kind of on the rocks a little bit at that point. And I've read this in the journal. I could kind of see, there's a little bit of turbulence going on in their relationship. And ultimately, it kind of fell apart shortly thereafter, around the time of the heist. And that's important to note as well. So a couple of months later, in May of 1990, so again, we're talking literally 2 months later, Brian decided to move to Los Angeles. And this is what's really fascinating to me about this, is that Brian lived on Beacon Hill in Boston there and decided to move to Los Angeles. And he had an apartment on Beacon Hill. And when he moved, and Stephanie talked about this with me, at the time he moved, he rented a van. And he rented a van for the purposes of putting his, furnishings and all that stuff into it and making the 3,000-mile journey across the United States from Boston to Los Angeles. It's also worth noting that this is in the day and age when the 55-mile-per-hour speed limit ruled. There were no, 75, 80-mile-per-hour speed limits around the United States. 55 was it. There were a few places that, had a little higher speed limit. Basically, my point is that that's a long ass ride. That's a long journey. That's going to take several days to drive the 3,000 miles. And one of the things that I thought about was, why would he do that? Who would do that? I know if I'm, got an apartment, I got some furniture or whatever, and I'm moving across country, I'm thinking to myself, I'll just sell my stuff here, get on a plane, fly to LA, and buy a new bed, buy a new couch, buy whatever I need to buy there. I'm sure as hell not going to rent a van and load up my stuff and drive all the way across the country. But that's the thing that's important to note. The guy did drive across the country. So he does get to LA, again, a couple of months after the heist takes place. As far as I know, he is completely unaware that the FBI is actually looking at him as a suspect. But it does appear that the FBI was already looking at Brian as a suspect, as in the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum heist. And again, Brian appeared to be completely unaware of it. So Brian locates in LA. He decides that he's going to pass himself off as somebody who's an accomplished writer, writing for the New Yorker and the Boston Globe and the New York Times and all kinds of various publications. He mentions that he has various awards and so forth for his writing and his scripts and things that he's written. He ends up becoming involved, becoming a member actually of the Writers Guild out there in Hollywood, and is involved with it in some capacity. Now, importantly, he meets up with a guy that ends up becoming a business partner of his, a guy named Ben Pollock. Now, Ben was a handful of years younger than Brian. He was a young guy at that time, somewhat impressionable, but nonetheless, he happens to meet Brian. Brian passes himself off as a guy who, is living in the Hollywood Hills, very successful and everything else. And Ben is impressed. And as Ben mentioned to me, and I've talked with Ben about this, as he described it to me, they decided to kind of collaborate. Ben and Brian were going to, work together and collaborate for the purposes of writing scripts and, writing shows and making money and, I guess, being famous or whatever the case may happen to be. And as it worked out, Ben actually had a few people that he knew. He actually had some contacts in LA, more than Brian actually. He said he was a little bit sort of surprised by that Brian seemed to be leveraging the limited context that Ben actually had. But, that makes sense. Now that we kind of know the type of guy who Brian was, it makes perfect sense. And through a series of leveraging some of those contacts and so forth, Ben and Brian did manage to get in front of a woman who worked for Discovery, I believe, or rather Disney. It was Disney. And they managed to actually get a deal. In other words, there was some interest on the part of her representing Disney to have the two of them write some scripts for some prospective programming that I guess ultimately Disney would theoretically produce. So the two guys, Brian and Ben, start collaborating, they start kind of brainstorming, trying to come up with some script ideas and so forth. And Brian had also written a few things already. He had some sort of scripts and things he had written out. And Ben told me that when he first looked at this stuff, he thought it was terrible. He was just shocked at how poor this stuff was. It just, just wasn't good quality work. And he was a little surprised because, again, up to that point, he had, been under the impression that Brian was a successful, reputable guy, had done all these things, won these awards and everything, and he just was a little taken aback. And so the more that they kind of discussed, various possible scripts and threw some ideas back and forth, they kind of weren't getting anywhere. And interestingly, Brian eventually came up with this script idea that he proposed to Ben one day. And Ben said this was really remarkable because it was the first time that Brian actually put something forward that actually kind of was cool in a way. It actually had a little bit of detail to it, and you could tell there was a little bit of passion in Brian's voice. He was talking about it, and it just, you could kind of visualize it. And the script basically involved the story that is basically involved two sort of loser, down on their luck kind of garden variety thieves getting together and deciding to rip off a museum. And they actually do rip off the museum, and they're shocked that they're successful at ripping it off. They go through with it, they kind of pull the trigger on it, and then once they're done with it, they're almost kind of like in a maze that, holy cow, we actually did rip off the museum. And they've got all this enormously valuable artwork here. But the problem is, as the story goes, that the idea was a little half-baked. They thought that they would simply be able to, fence the artwork, sell it, cash in, and, make a killing. But as it was, the artwork was just too hot and nobody wanted to deal with it. There was just basically no interest on the part of anybody to buy the artwork. And the story talks about this one thief ultimately bringing the artwork to Germany for the purposes of meeting with a prospective buyer. And the artwork was stashed in a cave in Germany. That's how the story goes. It was stashed in a cave in Germany. And apparently this meeting never took place. The guy bailed on him, something of that nature. And this created a really big problem for this thief, for these thieves that had ripped off this artwork, because they realized that they had something that they couldn't sell. It was really of no value. But the very big problem in their mind was that the artwork really served as sort of an albatross around the neck. In other words, they knew that as long as they possessed that artwork, that it was, it was like this spotlight that was just, they felt like it was this spotlight that was zeroed in on them that ultimately could land them in jail because, of course, they're possessing this artwork. So very coldly and very objectively, they ultimately decide to burn the artwork. And importantly, the script describes there being a couple of statues, metal statues as well, that were part of the artwork that they collected. And obviously those could not be destroyed by fire. So those were buried, apparently all in this cave in Germany. So I think that's very, very important and very, very telling, because I am of the opinion that the script, the story that Brian told to Ben, and this is, before the shit kind of hits the fan with him and with Brian, and he kind of gets outed publicly as a suspect in the Gardner Museum heist, which does eventually happen by way of several newspaper articles, and he ends up appearing on 60 Minutes and Inside Edition and a few other things. This happens before then. And Ben said, and I believe him, that it does appear that this story reigns true to some degree. I'm not saying that Brian had a prospective seller lined up in Germany and he brought the stuff and put it in a cave in Germany and had a meeting that fell through and, destroyed the stuff in Germany and buried the, a couple of the metal statues in Germany. But I think there is a lot of truth to the story ultimately. So having said that, let me tell you what I think happened and sort of tie this all in here. I do believe that Brian was involved, and I do believe that that other person that I mentioned that he was in Jamaica with in 1989, December 89, Steve Donahue, I think that it's likely that those two guys were involved. And I also believe that it was likely an inside job. Now, there were two guards that were in the museum that night watching or protecting the artwork that night. One guy named Rick Abbott and a guy named Randy Hested. So Rick and Randy. Starting with Randy had nothing to do with this. It's clear, the more you dig into that Randy was just straight up pure victim, had nothing to do with this. Rick, on the other hand, is a much more interesting person. I personally believe that Rick was involved with this thing. And I won't get into all the details with respect to it, but here are a couple of the reasons why. One of the reasons why is that there were motion detectors that were in play that night in the museum. And these motion detectors showed what the thieves were doing as they navigated the halls and some of the rooms of the museum on the night of the heist. Very importantly, pretty much all of the stuff, 12 of the 13 pieces, were stolen from the second floor of the museum. So they entered through the first floor, immediately made their way to the second floor once the guards were tied up, and this is where the damage was done, was the second floor. The most valuable stuff was there. But it's always been a mystery regarding that 13th piece. It's a painting called Chez Tortoni. That was stolen, that went missing from one of the galleries on the first floor of the museum. The reason why this is perplexing is because there were motion detectors on the first floor, but none of those motion detectors were tripped that night during the heist. And they were functioning. The system was tested shortly after the heist, and it was functioning perfectly well. So, it's hard to explain how did this piece go missing when apparently nobody entered that room during the time that the heist was taking place. Here's the one caveat here. The last individual, the last person that was noted entering the room called the Blue Room, where this particular painting was taken from, on the first floor again, the last person was the one security guard, Rick Abbott, who has come under a lot of suspicion. So he was the last person recorded entering and leaving that room. And the reason we know that is because these guards would one at a time kind of make their rounds around the museum, and you could follow the alarm activity as they made their rounds. This is all recorded and everything else, so the authorities could go back at a later date and look at the sort of the printout of the alarm data information and everything else, so they could essentially follow the footsteps. So they see that Rick was the last person to enter that room. Now, just looking at that alone, I'm saying there's no other possible choice. If the alarm system is functioning well, and it clearly shows that the one and only person, or the last person to enter that room was Rick, then he had to be the individual who stole the piece. What's also interesting to note is that it appears that he walked in there, and again, this is my theory, this is what I think happened. It appears that he walked into the room and ripped off the piece. And at this time, there's no robbery taking place or anything else. It's just that he just lifted the piece off the wall. Following the motion detector data, I can see that Rick went up to the top floor of the museum right after that took place and momentarily stepped out on the roof. And this is at night. This is in the middle of the night. So he momentarily stepped out on the roof for no more than a minute, then walked back in from the roof and made his way down to the second floor, and he made his way to what is called the Dutch room. Now, the Dutch room is where the damage was done. This is where the Vermeer was, this is where the Rembrandts were, and some other things as well. So this is where the damage was done. But Rick made his way down to that room, and he was in that area for about 5 minutes, and then he finishes up kind of his rounds and works his way back to the station. And we know this happened. This isn't my theory here. We know that happened, that's the path he took, because we have the motion detector data that shows that. Now, shortly thereafter, after Rick finally gets back to the station and the other guard, Randy, starts making his rounds, this is when Rick momentarily opens the door, the side door to the museum, which is on the opposite side of the museum is where the roof was. The roof, when he was on the roof, put him on one side of the museum. The door he opened up was on the opposing side of the museum. But he momentarily did that, and there's never really been a good explanation of why he did that. In fact, it's actually a very risky proposition because anybody could just, walk in the door, overpower him as he's opening it, and just walk right in the museum at that point. But nonetheless, he did that, and Rick admits as much. And it was shortly thereafter that he actually says that the couple of Boston police officers, buzzed the outside door, said that they were responding to some disturbance, and he actually lets them in. He buzzes the cops in, these two guys who he says are cops, and the rest is history as far as this goes. So what I think happened here is that Rick stole the piece from that 13th piece from the Blue Room on the first floor. I believe that he walked up to the roof with that piece in hand and with a flashlight probably signaled the two thieves sitting in their car. They were in what has been described as a hatchback on a particular road on one side of the museum, essentially saying, hey, this is basically a go. At that point, the thieves would have driven around to the other side of the museum onto a place called Palace Road, and they would have waited. And they did wait there for about another 45 minutes or so. Eventually, Rick opens the door on Palace Road there, momentarily and closes it. I think that served as a second signal from Rick to the thieves. Then shortly thereafter, the thieves go to the door, they ring the doorbell. They would have known that Rick was the only person there at the security desk. He's the person that could buzz them in, and the rest unfolds. So I think that's what happens there. Now, I do think, again, that the two thieves were Brian McDevitt, and I think Steve Donahue was also likely the other thief. It's very important to note here that the one guard that I do not believe was involved in this thing at all, Randy, he did mention that once he saw some pictures of suspects and things of that nature, he said with 90 to 95% certainty, he was convinced that the individual that ultimately bound him and brought him downstairs and tied him up downstairs in the basement of the museum, he said that he was 90 to 95% certain that that individual was Brian McDevitt. That's a very important thing because this is one of the guys, and he's pointing to somebody specifically by virtue in the name of Brian McDevitt as being involved. So I believe that what happened next is that the artwork was placed somewhere in Boston. Either Brian hauled that stuff up to his Beacon Hill apartment, or he stashed it somewhere else. But I believe that's ultimately what happened with the artwork in the aftermath. I believe that the reason Brian stole the art was because he had this half-baked idea that he would be able to sell it to this drug ring, this international drug ring that was situated in Jamaica. It's interesting to note that, remember, Brian was in Jamaica a few months before the heist took place on some business. And I'm not exactly sure what the business is, but I'm theorizing that he sort of knew in passing about this drug ring. I don't know that he was dealing specifically with the individuals, but I think he knew somebody who knew somebody involved with this drug ring kind of thing, so he was aware of it. So I think that he had this half-baked notion in his mind that, hey, I'm going to rip off this art and then I'm going to sell it to this drug ring. The reason that he would sell it to the drug ring is because they actually use this art like this, for collateral. And this isn't something I've dreamed up. This is the truth. This kind of high dollar art working in kind of the, some of these illicit realms, if you will, especially the drug realm, international drug realm, is oftentimes used as collateral for drug trading and things of that nature. Very importantly, about a year after the heist took place in 1991, Italian authorities actually busted this drug ring in Jamaica, and they uncovered this warehouse that had 29 pieces of high-end pieces of art that had been stolen from an Italian museum back in 1987, so 4 years earlier. So they busted this ring. They found these 29 pieces of art that had been ripped off 4 years earlier at this Italian museum. And those pieces of art were described as being used exclusively for the purposes that I just mentioned. That is, for collateral in the drug trade, in the high-stakes drug trade. So I suspect what happened here is that, Brian again had this half-baked notion that he was gonna ultimately sell this stuff to this drug ring, but he ran into a couple of problems. Obviously, immediately after the heist took place, it just blew up. Front page of the newspaper, $200 billion in art. I mean, basically the stuff was hot as, nuclear waste at that point. So I think he immediately realized that, it wasn't like these guys were clamoring, or for that matter, anybody was clamoring to buy this stuff, but certainly not these guys in Jamaica. So I think at a minimum, he realized, if there's a sale that's going to be transacted with respect to this artwork, that it's not going to happen right now. It's going to take a little bit of time. But what ends up happening, obviously, a year later, that ring gets busted and they're no longer in business. And so if there had been any opportunity previous to that of them selling the artwork to this particular ring, it no longer existed. And at that point, I think what happened is Brian's basically left holding the bag. He's left holding this artwork that he can't get rid of. Now again, remember, he moved a couple of months after the heist. He moved from Boston to LA, and he moved with a van hauling his furniture. I'm speculating here that the reason he did that, the reason he opted to do that, was because at the same time he could also move the artwork. It would have been very easy, for example, in the box spring of his mattress, to conceal those paintings. Some of the other pieces that are smaller could have easily been hidden in some of his furnishings as well. But that's a very, inconspicuous way to, kind of just take all that stuff and move it from Boston to LA. And I do believe ultimately that's what ended up happening as far as it goes. Now, this is where, about this time, things start getting interesting. Because as 1991 rolls around, the fall of 1991, the FBI starts knocking at Brian's door. And at this point, Brian is definitely aware that the FBI is looking into him. And they interviewed him multiple times. And a short time after that, leading into 1992, is when Brian was sort of publicly outed as a suspect in the case. Boston Globe, New York Times, LA Times, they actually all wrote articles in the first half of 1992. 60 Minutes came a-knocking. He was on 60 Minutes. That aired in November 29th, 1992. Inside Edition kind of like, pounced on him and he did one of those drive-by kind of things, to talk to Brian about it. But basically the guy was outed in a big way, and then frankly in a very embarrassing way, because it became obvious at that point that this guy was just a world-class con man, and that he was also a suspect related to the artwork. So if we fall back and recall that story, that script that he had relayed, which was about that time, right around 91 flipping into 92, was when Brian conveyed that script idea to Ben. It's about that time when that took place. So I am of the opinion that that was basically art mimicking true life at that point. I do not believe that Brian actually took the artwork to Germany and put it in a cave, tried to meet with somebody and burned it. But I do believe that Brian ultimately destroyed the paintings. I do believe he burned them. The reason why is because it had been expressed to Ben, his partner, among others, that if there is one thing that Brian was deathly afraid of and that he was not going to let happen to him, is he was not going to go to jail. And the way Ben described Brian to me was he's the kind of guy who, feeling pressure, as described in this theoretical script that had been talked about, if he felt like the authorities were kind of getting a little close to him and this artwork, frankly, was creating more damage, more harm than good, he wouldn't have thought twice about taking a match to it and just burning it all. Irrespective of the facts of the cultural significance, irrespective of the fact that the stuff is worth hundreds of millions of dollars, irrespective of the fact that the stuff is 400 years old, Brian wouldn't have thought twice about it again. He's just sort of a soulless guy. Brian came first. Who gives a damn about the collateral damage? All he gave a shit about was, let me get rid of this stuff and be done with it. And I do believe that is what happened, sad to say. Now, it is very interesting to note that in this script that Brian talked about, he talked about a couple of metal statues. Now that's fascinating to consider, because for those of us who are familiar with the Gardner Museum, we know that there were a couple of bronze pieces stolen in addition to the paintings. There was a bronze finial that was stolen. There was also a bronze Chinese coup, almost like a beaker, that was stolen. Those two items could not have been destroyed by fire. And as the script goes, these two items were buried. So I think that in all likelihood, those two items actually were buried, which therefore means they are still potentially recoverable. I think they're recoverable. So that's the sad truth of what I believed ultimately happened regarding the artwork from the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. It explains an awful lot. It explains why, somebody hasn't come forward after the statute of limitations. It explains why somebody hasn't come forward to claim, the $10 million or anything of that nature at all. It explains an awful lot. One thing I should mention is that one of the things that happened was in August of 1993. Again, this is, a year or so after kind of Brian was outed publicly and the FBI started sniffing around and everything. Brian actually was called in front of a federal grand jury in Boston, and he did obviously talk to the grand jury. Shortly thereafter, he moved to Brazil. So he moved to Brazil shortly after that August 1993 federal grand jury meeting. And according to another friend of his, a guy named Nat Segaloff, whom I also spoke with, he was told that from Brian directly, he was told that the reason Brian did that is because Brian was thinking that he was going to get indicted. So Brian ultimately flees to Brazil. He's in Brazil for a number of years, then makes his way to Colombia, and then ultimately gets HIV, according to Brian, and passes away in Colombia in 2004. So Brian never came back to the United States. And if we're to believe Brian, the reason he did that is because he was afraid ultimately of being indicted and getting prosecuted. So that does beg the question, is that the way an innocent person acts? If Brian's not guilty of, stealing the art at the Isabel Stewart Gardner Museum, doesn't it seem to be somewhat of a drastic course of action to take to uproot from the Hollywood Hills and, roll down to Brazil and Central America, Colombia? I mean, there are finer places to be than Colombia, especially during that time. But that's what he did, never came back. And that's the sad reality of it all. So having said all that, I don't think we're ever going to see those pieces of art again, because I do think they were destroyed. Now, I've done a lot of research into this case, and I do believe I have a pretty good idea of where I think the items were destroyed. I also have a pretty solid theory of where I think those two bronze pieces, again, the finial and the coup, would have been buried. So sometime in the very near future, myself and at least one other individual, we're going to be looking into this particular area to see if we can, if not recover those two pieces that would have been buried, at least try to find some sort of evidence that the artwork was actually there and actually burned. Now, having said all of that, I do hold out hope that maybe the other pieces are there as well. It is possible that, Brian was just being melodramatic and burning all this stuff was just being melodramatic, even though it makes an awful lot of sense, especially if you're concerned about getting caught, red-handed with the stuff. And that's just the way Brian was. So I do hold out hope, even though I think it's remote, that, we find those two bronze pieces. We also find the rest of the artwork secreted away. But I don't think that's likely. I think that the stuff was destroyed, and I do think those two bronze pieces, however, are still out there just waiting to be found. So that's it. That's where I am today, folks. That's where I am with all of this. So I know this was a long video. There's a lot of information I wanted to get out there. There's a lot more of information that I'm not putting into this. Obviously, there's a lot of detail and a lot of other things. We just don't have the time to do it. But nonetheless, I wanted to give you an idea of who I think was involved. I wanted to give you an idea of how I think it happened, and what sort of motivated and what actually happened. And then, of course, ultimately what happened with it. And I will certainly keep you up to date with respect to my attempts to actually find the artwork, or at least those two bronze pieces, which wouldn't have been very easy to destroy. So, all right, folks, there we go. That's what I've got for you today. If you have any comments or questions, of course, feel free to shoot me an email, eric@ericulis.com. And until next time, folks, as always, cheers.